marrying, and we have interpenetrating of these different, even what are seen as, and in the past were seen as fighting neighborhoods and ethnic battles, that people made them different because they were different ethnic groups. But if you have people are now moving together, living together, intermarrying, the meaning of these things are changing. And this is what makes life and cities more generally more complicated. These are what are also called sometimes primordial, say the background, national origin. And in the early 20th century, when people talk about, are people different from each other because of genes of their blood or because of their ideas? And if it's just their ideas, maybe they could be changed. But if it comes from their, Blut und Boden, the land and blood, if the terms that were used in the 1930s in Germany, those kinds of conceptions were, and still, this is still there. That is, the Russians and the Ukrainians are talking very actively in these same terms. But if you begin to read more closely, as we had a finding such as I've told you about Peter Ochterberg and I finding, hey, the arts, this matters. There's a book on Russian culture I ran across called Natasha's Dance. And Natasha, who was a character in a leading novel in Russia, it's written by an Englishman, and he draws on and synthesizes lots of cultural, sub-regional, distinctive styles. And one thing that he really played up I hadn't seen before is Genghis Khan. Russia was dominated for 250 years by the Mongols. Genghis Khan, they then later on were called the yellow tents. The yellow, that is, there were many other people who were recruited. They were not ethnically identical as they moved closer, and they conquered more and more. They conquered all of China. They burned down all of Beijing, and they killed everybody, or they drove them out. They went to the largest city in Russia, Kiev, and killed everybody. After that, they said, you don't need to kill everybody, but you can see what we can do if you don't follow us. And for 250 years, there was a sense of domination. But if you then look a little closer, the little groups fighting together of 10 or 20 or 15, whatever, were only together. They would only fight, charge, act, shoot, if they all agreed that we're ready. They would decide in an egalitarian way. Wow. But higher up, when you got up to Genghis Khan himself, he and the people immediately under him followed just what he said, and he gave the orders. Charge! Let's go! We're going to take over. Russia is coming next. Actually, they didn't say that. Russia didn't exist at the time. But the subtlety and the deep importance of these cultural regions and life and conceptions we'll draw on more a little bit as we go on, but we'll make the examples I know best. I'll draw from personal experience, but also I've read a lot more literature, culture, history, movies, and so forth. France, the U.S., and China. So we'll come in from others, but the point generally I'm making is we're getting diversity, and we had that in the 19th century. There's a sociological classification of it. We're going to call it, in simple terms, urban-rural. But then they would say, what's the culture of urbanity? and that Zimmel wrote about this. Louis Wirth, W-I-R-T-H, here in Chicago, wrote about big cities as impersonal, cold, distant, and so forth. Wirth did not talk about the subtleties of ethnicity, but we're getting more of this now as we have these things coming together. And so I'll mention just in passing, this is in all of the social sciences, and some of the leaders, Gary Becker, in his own PhD, he talked of human capital. Bob Fogle's, these are both Nobel Prize winning economists. Fogle's book, Time on the Cross, tried to look at where and why the culture of the American South deeply interpenetrated the African American subculture in different neighborhoods in Chicago today. George Tully, Start Modeling Seriously Smoke and Cold January Temperatures. And then tried to say, hey, what they began to say is these are non-market goods. They're not traded in a market the way Adam Smith talked about it. And the term which then is now widely used is amenity, A-M-E-N-I-T-Y. What's an amenity? A non-market good or service. Smoke, war, peace, crime that's high in your neighborhood. These kinds of concerns we'll talk about a lot more, but economists classically studied one at a time. Atomism, trying to say, what's the elasticity of adding a cinema, a movie house, in a neighborhood, or having more cinemas or in Broadway shows in that Broadway area of Manhattan? How much does that transform the style and the value of land if you're not buying the buildings? So how do you measure the value of amenities? They began to develop ways of doing this, but they tried to do this. We'd have just follow the normal assumption, quote unquote, ceteris paribus, all other things equal, then, if this were true, then this ought to happen. If you then tried to test it with actual data, to do that, you have to have a whole lot of other variables to control, so that there may be other things that make the Broadway section or Bronzeville different from other neighborhoods. Okay, I co-taught a course in urban economics with George Tully. I mean, I read and talked with the economist, and I said, you know, we ought to be able to do something better. Let's get a lot of data about not only movie houses, but also restaurants, cafes, hotels, nightclubs, bookstores, and get hundreds of these different kinds of amenities, and we can measure these for different zip codes and different blocks. And then the concept could be, well, I would have a new concept. So I bike, and where'd this come from? In part from living in Bronzeville, but also from biking all around the city of Chicago. And as I would bike, I'd also have 2 years of being an art student, trying to, sketch. Then I didn't have enough talent to really become another Renoir, as you see. So I don't have paintings, but I see the world differently in part because of that. And living and working in France for several years, as a student, teaching at the Sorbonne, and so forth. So the scene is a concept maybe we ought to make sense of. Maybe we ought to take the idea of not talking about one amenity like the cinema. Let's look for a scene. We can talk about the Broadway scene or the Bronzeville scene, and then think of what are the components of this. And then we worked on this for 15 years, and here's the result, called Scenescapes. And it's now been picked up in China. They have a Scenes Academy. There are about 10 books on these in Chinese. There are 500 papers on scenes in China. The national 5-year plan was classically used every year or two. Ever since Mao up to present, they were booming along. They've been growing the economy, twice as fast, 3 times as fast as people in the West. They worked very hard. They carefully tried to control or hold down consumption and spending too much money or paying attention. Too much lipstick, too many fancy, nice red shoes, pretty blouses, these things. No. Work. Say we're building a new China, and it worked. So then they've now gotten, one of you who've been living away from China, you went back, you just told me at break, you now go back and you see in the last 5 years so much more what? Just mention that.
So much more restaurants and smaller consumptions, such as just like drinks and boba tea shops are getting so much more, and also more like minor consumptions that are under like Fuji yuan is like getting so much more popular than I remember when I was in middle school.
Okay, much more attention with consumption, and this happened as well in Eastern Europe. After 1989, with the end of communism in Eastern Europe, where they've been building and stressing the economy. But similarly, the point I'm making is the 5-year plan dropped the economic growth and say we're going to build, a new economy and expand 12% this year, and each year 12% for the next 5 years. They dropped it. And instead they added, in 6 places, scenes. And scenes came out of this book when it was translated into Chinese. So people paid a lot of attention to how they're changing the criteria of what we want to build in China. They also have created, just one example, National Cultural Parks, P-A-R-K. We have national parks in Italy, in the U.S., but they have things like the Grand Canyon. That's called a national park. In China, they put together, say, 3 states, like, say, Wyoming, Colorado, and New York, or say, if they're adjacent, let's say New York, Connecticut, 3 or 4 others. And the whole region is called a national cultural park. And these are new in the last 5 to 10 years, but they become very important, and people go to entertain, and the entertainment can include all kinds of things which are cities as well as pretty landscape, mountains, rivers, swimming, but also historic battles, historic reasons. And China has so much history. There are all kinds of things you can celebrate if you have a huge area like this. Okay. So my point is, these things are changing in, China, with its long history and traditions, is nevertheless rebuilding the country dramatically right now in recent years. And so these kinds of issues are more explicit, thinking about how are we going to, what's new, how do we want to do it? And the Communist Party is not simply acting top down, as all the textbooks say and did, if you will, at least ideally, if you follow that line. They're tearing down neighborhoods. They're tearing down and saying, these are slums, these are bad, this is run down. Let's rebuild, and then you have people knocking on the door, holding meetings and saying, what would you like to have in your street? Would you like to have a restaurant, a cafe, a bookstore, a shoe store, salon, whatever? That is, the Communist Party is listening to citizens the way markets are supposedly doing in Adam Smith's theories. And one girl is doing one young woman is doing a PhD on why is the Communist Party embracing scenes? Okay. The complex of interconnected themes inform the activities on the USC campus and some nearby neighborhoods. These specifically include the Logan Center right across the Midway. Student plays, stand-up comedy, musical performances, rehearsal, poetry readings, painting, sculpture, editing of videos, digital design. None of these existed on this campus 10 years ago. You know, we did physics, we did math. We didn't do this kind of active, student-engaged arts and culture so well that we're now competing with it. Basically the average test scores and competitiveness of selection of students is basically the same at Harvard, Yale, Chicago, Princeton, Stanford, roughly. That was not true. That is, the students here were not as strong today as they are now. You are more of an elite. And it is nationally important and distinctive. And the arts is part of what attract a good chunk of you here, at least combined with other things. Not just football, and we don't, you know, we're classically very weak on football, but the entertaining issue. The arts are dramatically new, is my point, but this is not an art school, nevertheless. People are doing this along and mixed with, so people are getting, you know, BAs majoring in economics and cinema, economics and film, political science and design and architecture. And these kinds of things are now possible, and they're new. That Apple stopped hiring a bunch of people with MBAs, and they hired a bunch of people with MFAs, Masters of Fine Arts. The guy who was in charge of music was a rapper. Oh, okay. The Neubauer Collegium is explicitly focused on enhancing interconnections between the arts and the social sciences and the humanities. So these kinds of things. Neubauer was a chairman of the board of trustees of the university. So our Scenes Idea project is trying to integrate aesthetics, design, and culture with the social science analysis of neighborhoods as the core urban dynamics are going on around us. And several dozen other projects have been funded or reported on in conferences, videos, scenes, and so forth. Is this just the affluent people? Is this only the rich? So in our first section on reading, we will include, I'll just mention by name, Theaster Gates, Gates, like the same name, Bill Gates. He's a poor guy, had no money. He was a potter. He made pots as an artist. He saw there were some empty, abandoned houses that are for sale. $10,000 you can get a house. He didn't have any money, so he borrowed the money from his sister and his mother. Got a loan. Got one house. He fixed it up using his own hands, making it beautiful. He didn't then sell it for $40,000 or $50,000. He called it black music. He then got some record collections, and he found another house and fixed it up, put the record collection in there. He had a bookstore. A bookstore was closing down, and they gave him a lot of the books. So he got black music, black books, etc. And let kids in the neighborhood just come in and read. listen to, they'd have a DJ, they'd perform some of the music, they'd have some of the films, and they'd talk about them afterward. So he was trying to, he was part of the neighborhood. He got to know the kids in the neighborhood themselves, and etc. In Italy, they give a prize to the different kinds of artists doing different things. He was awarded at least the prize for the most influential artist in the world. Take a look at his stuff as we proceed. He's using the aesthetics of beauty and the arts to bring to low-income African-American neighborhoods in Chicago. Some of his people heard about what we were doing, and they came to me and said, could you talk to us about it? And said, okay. So we talked together, and they gave me some of my classes. We met, and so we worked together. We had 4 people do master's theses on different aspects of what Theaster Gates was doing, because he was, for instance, he was in a conference I went to with 200 people. He was there with the dean of the Harris School, where he had a position, and the Lead Foundation, which was giving him several $100,000 to be doing these kinds of things, and the commissioner on culture in the city of Chicago, who wanted to learn and listen and comment. All 3 of them asked, how can we build this up? How can we not just be 2 or 3 neighborhoods? How can we bring this across the city of Chicago or Detroit, Cleveland? And he said, basically, I don't know. So we work with him with one of the MAs, and he now has a program, aesthetic rehabilitation. And he introduced it with some poets, with some music, with some DJs. His videos are fantastic. Take a look. Bringing Theaster up to scale, as he and they call this. We build here, in trying to do this kind of thing, we've been addressing questions broadly from the 1980s onward on urban innovation. The title was FAUI, Fiscal, Austerity, and Urban Innovation. The first word was FISCAL. Money was what we were talking about. We thought money would make the difference, maybe, and that if austerity was cutting money, would that lead people to innovate? Answer: no, it didn't work. Innovators are not people who have less money. They're not necessarily cutting. That is, it's being cut, but the innovation tends to come, we found, more often by new kinds of political leaders. A new kind of mayor would get elected, would try to do things in a very different way. So in Orange County, you'd have a guy, and the people would lock arms. They'd hold together. They'd get a crowd in the 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when the rush hour. They'd stop the traffic on the freeway, and he was elected mayor of Irvine. Okay. New people in Orange County said, we don't want cars, we don't want traffic, we want to transform Orange County into a different lifestyle, focus more on consumption. And it worked. So, but we have diversity within Orange County, and some places like Irvine are very environmental focused. Okay. So we published 50 books, including 30 in 35 countries, with multiple projects, data, over 10,000 cities. But one big theme was the decline of the traditional left and right and party politics, and the rise of consumption, social issues. We then called them, we just called them social issues. But the major examples were things like the environment, human rights, and then what has later come to be named as diversity. We explored these further and we started the Scenes Project, which is the main focus of the course today, and the name of the Scenescapes book is the most detailed report focused with data mostly from the US and US and Canada. We have, as I mentioned, we have 10 books in China and Chinese and more coming along. The one with the picture I like best on the cover was Can Tocqueville Karaoke. As you see, Tocqueville is there with his microphone, using his ability to try to dance a little bit and to sing along in a way that this can be a new version of karaoke. But how can that potentially use the arts to transform the participatory meaning of Tocquevillian citizen participation? And so that's what we explore in the book. Basically we take the main Western theories of economic growth and of political participation from Tocqueville, and one of the main economic theories now is creativity, new ideas. Schumpeter's innovation, or the English magazine The Economist has got a section all the time called Schumpeter. Okay, Schumpeter is an innovation kind of idea. Richard Florida's book on the rise of the creative class has been a bestseller, making this kind of argument. Okay, so the point is, where and how can these combinations work to add the arts and transform the normal narrower meaning of economic growth in the sense of creativity, and the Tocquevillian citizen participation as Putnam has used them. So the bottom line is, we're saying you've got to combine things. You've got to recognize the distinctive rules of the game, the dynamics of how these processes work in different neighborhoods. And instead of saying there's one right or one wrong way, we have to make all the cities do just this. We've got to recognize the diversity. If you're riding an ecologically sensitive bicycle or driving a car and have this battery go on and off, and it's different than if you've got a big truck SUV. SUVs are illegal in Paris. You can't drive cars into Oslo for 20 years. You haven't been able to drive a car into Oslo unless you pay money. They don't want cars there in the downtown. And New York started doing this about 2 years ago. You got to pay about $20 if you want to cross a bridge and go toward Wall Street. Okay. The examples of cultural place making, two but extreme types, are starchitecture, such as illustrated by downtown Beijing for the Olympics about 10 years ago. They tore down massive numbers, hundreds of thousands of people were moved out, and they built grand architectural statements, which are starchitecture. That transforms Beijing's downtown image away. It's totally, the architecture has nothing to do with China. They were foreign architects, came from Italy, from South Africa, and so forth, chosen through competition. But the Chinese architects were saying, don't do this. We have traditions of China. And the president of China, the mayor of Beijing said, no, we want internet. We want to have a new kind of conception of architecture and of the city of Beijing for the Olympics, and we want to make it the more grand. And it was probably the most powerfully new, distinctive Olympics ever compared to any before, at least using architecture. I'll simply, let me end with 2 words, and let's have a little discussion, just to say that I've been simultaneously doing an oral history of Chicago since the election of Harold Washington with Bill and Jackie Grimshaw were the campaign managers of Harold Washington. And we started in 1983 when Harold Washington was the first black mayor. It continues with many students and others collaborating. We've published 2 books, and one is called Trees and Real Violins. And we include this along with a little bit of the sections in the book. And I'm making the simple point that we try to combine methods and data, not just numbers, not just one case. We want both. We want to try to take insights that come from reading Susan Sontag, reading and thinking about the meaning of that architecture in Beijing, how and what do people say when they see it. Time on the cross. What does it mean if you're an African American to spend time on the cross, etc. Let me stop with that as questions and say let's discuss from your reactions on any of this. Do you have a hand up? Or you did before. You had a good question, comment before. You want to lead off with a question or comment?
Just to say anything?
Say that again?
No, it's just to have any questions or comments on the course material.
Yes, that would be great.
So I'm quite interested about the virtual space, because like in the digital age, it is very hard to ignore about like there's a lot of like online communities.
Quiet, please. Class is here. Thank you.
So
virtual space. Yeah.
Yes, it is very hard to ignore about like there are lots of like online communities. They're doing like their social movement mobilized online, and
absolutely.
Yeah, and social media. There's lots of informations and things. And for example, if the government has any policies about like we are going to remove certain buildings in the neighborhood, and people will have reactions regarding the information they received online. So it's not like they just waiting for for the government doing anything. It's not just like top down, but when considering about like it's not just the top down process. It's the internet is very hard to ignore. So
and yes, it is bottom up, absolutely. But that is, it can be both. But go ahead.
I just no, I don't really have any questions or comments about that. But I just want to know like how to understand this.
Okay.
This
no,
internet
absolutely. I mean, it's central. It's critical. I taught a seminar 2 years ago. We had 15 students. They're all writing MAs. I think 11 of the 15 were Chinese, and all the Chinese were using the internet as one source of data, but they each used different groups, different social media groups. One was and there were five writing on women, 5 drastically different aspects of women in China. It's from why do traditional families want young girls to learn how to play the violin, and others do not. And then what was the role of this importance in the family and in the daughter playing the violin? And they would play not Chinese music, they play Mozart, Tchaikovsky, and so forth. Okay, so my simple point is I'm agreeing with you 110% that we want to include social media along with all these other processes. And so in that sense, my including of the microphone in the voice and in the picture of Tocqueville is we want to update and look for ways of using current technology, from cell phones to microphones to the internet, and then join this with the traditions of the cafe, which was a, let's say the English and the Italian and the French conceptions, as they came to Asia, where and why they get transformed. And so this will be a section we'll talk about, as well as, of course, politics. And I mentioned the gangs, the ballad of the bullet, meaning the bullet, the B-A-L-L-A-D, the ballad part is that this is now social media, online, internet, music, and performance combined with a threat of violence. And this is now more powerful emotionally because you can combine. This is part of why the arts is adding something powerfully, is it engages emotion and feeling. And this was in the words of Susan Sontag, which was there. This is not science. This is not logic. This is ideally about emotional reactions. Okay, so yes, we want to bring in the arts and the emotions from the arts into the social sciences, because this is what make people people. What make people different? What makes cities and neighborhoods different from one another? These are part. If we ignore them and let's just say poor people want to become rich people, that'll explain 5% maybe. It doesn't explain 95, etc. Who else has a comment or question or wants to elaborate on or disagree with anything that I've said? Yeah, anything that I've said which you that you either have not heard or thought that something seems intuitively wrong. Tell us about it. That is, almost none of the stuff we read is going to be, in a simple sense, wrong, and something else is right. But the question is where and why they don't work, and where and why they're distinctive. Hand is up. Yeah?
So you mentioned briefly some stuff about like scenes in cities, and so I'm wondering, are those ultimately negative or positive for a city? Because obviously, like, they bring in certain demographics to certain neighborhoods, which leads to like economic prosperity, but like it also leads to greater divisions. So I'm kind of a little curious about that, about like the effect of scenes on cities as a whole.
A scene can be a very dangerous scene, such as the Ballad of the Bullet. That's the title of the book. Is how these not only are the scene of the person holding a gun, who is meant to be people afraid of him, and the place that he come from, the neighborhoods he lives in, are meant to be scary. So in that sense, if you want to have low crime, then it's negative. If you want to try to label it as I'm a tougher guy and I live here, but I went for instance when I went to Houston once at a conference, and I was in a neighborhood a little bit tough, and I went down to go out running after midnight, and the guy at the door said, you know, this is a little bit questionable neighborhood to go running at after midnight here. And I said, oh, I'm from Chicago. Oh, okay. All right, if I'm from Bronzeville in Chicago, you know, I can run in Houston and anywhere. Okay. So in that sense, we can. So the second part of your point is that not only can you have high crime, I'm adding explicitly where and why do you evaluate one thing as positive or negative. And the answer in the book is we don't have a good or a bad. We have 15 dimensions, such as theatricality, localism, neighborliness, tradition, these kinds of things, glamour, these kinds of things can be very different in their meaning, and they conflict with each other as they do in different people in different neighborhoods, or the same person could do different activities. So not just seeing these as messy and so forth. My point is, we're living with this now. That cities are more this way, life is more this way than they were 100 years ago, where there were simpler models of what's right and wrong, or people in the Middle Ages would, you know, the aristocrats and the king would wear certain colors and certain kinds of clothes, whereas now you go to, say, at least 30 years ago, if you went to Tokyo, everybody had a dark blue suit, and it looks as if they came from the same store. They all looked identical. Okay, now China, Tokyo are changing, and you're getting more individual, searching for diversity and for individualization of dress and action, writing, and poetry, all kinds of other things. Social media. So that's a quick answer, which we will elaborate through, and this is the main driver of the ideas through the course, and it will try to interpret and to give answers coherently to your question. Yes.
Can you elaborate more on the effect that civic participation, whether like that be high or low?
Aim your camera. Just elaborate the what effects.
Can you elaborate
civic?
The effect of like high or low civic participation, like on the note of Tocqueville, on like a city or country, on like the foundational aspects of like a city or country?
Well, I just briefly here in the last discussion, I've mentioned 5 or 6 examples touching on some of the. I mean, there's a ton of literature on this, but I mentioned, for example, the Tocquevillian idea that participation leads to more trust and to more legitimacy, and I gave the numbers from Scandinavia versus Southern Europe, and Northern versus Southern Italy, and then Latin America. So these are powerful, and then the same thing is true if you go city by city within the U.S. L.A. has the lowest trust of any major metro area in the U.S. Palo Alto is very high, for instance, etc. So there's city differences, there are neighborhood differences, but these are dimensions that are theorized and measured as components that we can bring in as parts of these scenes. And so instead of just saying the scene, we bring in these kinds of things like trust, participation, and then where and how they're interrelated. That's the whole point of that. Is you'll give the structure of this, you'll get the structure of this as we proceed. Is that yes? Two questions. You haven't talked before, so go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, so in chapter 1 of your book, you mentioned sort of looking at the dimensions in different metaphors with like either chemical elements or fruit flies. And I was just wondering, since there's always like 1,000 different ways to look at it through metaphors, why those 2 metaphors specifically captured it. And I guess sort of another way to frame the question is like, what are you trying to get at in terms of framing it like chemical elements or fruit flies?
Okay. The excellent question to ask. He's read something right at the beginning of this book, and the point is, both of these are metaphors of taking something we can see around us, such as tasting it like a bitter taste, but we'd like to understand what the chemicals are and what the combination of chemicals could transform that. And fruit flies. I mean, I've often said you really, to understand a city, ought to study one city in great depth. And my answer is yes, let's do that, but let's also look at them as fruit flies and let's have thousands of these. And if we have any question about how to do this, should we study one country and even assume, people who do that often will say the country is this way, Russia's this way, and the Ukraine is that way. The question, my answer to that is, it's better that is, Durkheim said, science begins with comparison. You can't compare unless you've got a bunch of these. And so in that sense, the metaphor of the fruit fly and the table of chemical elements gives us a way to take the data, the examples, the material, the experiences we see in life every day into science. And so what we're trying to do in this book is to make scenes into science. That's the shorter version. So we're at the end of the class for today. Or no, I'm not sure. We go to. We go to 6:20, so we have another half hour. Okay, so let me listen to what you or anybody else want to follow up on want to about the fruit fly or the table of contents, table of elements. That is, I've talked to you about scenes, and I've talked to people and said, hey, what you're doing is talk about what you're doing is a table of social elements, and I would say, exactly. So that is people from the hospital, people from biology, who think in terms of chemistry and chemical combinations. We have this as well in our cities, and it's another reason it's good to bring this in is to say we've got diversity. We have instead of saying it's only about aesthetics and the style of your cowboy boots and your miniskirt, the question is how does that combination generate the reaction? And so the campiness is yes, it's powerful to hear and to see and to think about it, but how can we use that metaphor, that term, to try to begin to understand the dynamics of aesthetics applied beyond just miniskirts and cowboy boots? That is, how can we understand what happens in a park or a cultural park in China? And then if people are building a cultural park, they're then deciding what is proper, because they're also rewriting history, if you will, in a way that this is consistent with what their political orientation. So the Trump appointed himself the chairman of the board of the Kennedy Theater in Washington, and he wants to be able to be more sensitive as to what kinds of performances are American and what is meant as American. And so these kinds of things are going on in China, in the U.S., and Russia, and the Ukraine, for sure. But anybody want to follow up on that? That is, have you heard this in any of your other classes? You're trying to join aesthetics with, let's say, mathematics, and with the kinds of methodology you have in biology or physics or economics. That is, the more, okay, let's say the Paul Samuelson economics, which is mathematical modeled on physics. Right now, I say that because right now the economics department is deeply transforming itself in the whole discipline as Gary Becker and his students are doing. Follow up, we had two hands, and yeah, go ahead.
My question was also from the book. You mentioned the three analytical components of scenes with the
Would you pull your best out just when you're talking?
The theatricality, the authenticity, and legitimacy, and you talked about like how those were intertwined with each other in the book. So I was wondering if you could expand on how they work together.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to. We'll do that as we read and talk about it. But it's great that two of you have at least have looked at a little bit of that. But let me just add a couple of brief comments. One way to elaborate this book, and I've been using Tocqueville in the political theme. The economic theme I mentioned was Schumpeter and the idea of urban innovation. And urban innovation is a major aspect of how and why the economy grows. It's not just working harder and being tougher and putting in more hours. It's using, and so what Gary Becker did in his PhD was to increase the human capital. What's human capital? It's what's in your head, what's in people's heads. If we can have more smart stuff in people's heads, we don't need dollars and cents. We don't need gold and silver. We need more people who can have more capital in their minds and in their thinking. And each of these are resources. They're not results. That is, having money doesn't mean that you can make more or effectively. The question is, how can we take the physical commodities and transform them into beauty or neighborliness or something else? Is it through building a car with a big engine with lots of steel? And I mentioned the SUV is illegal in Paris because they have thin streets. You can't have these things parking, and they'll block up all the traffic and everything else. So the combinations of different elements which can combine to make a scene more what? More of each of the kinds of things. So in the book we'll elaborate many different things, but the simple point is, for instance, I just read a paper on globalization. And what is global? I just finished teaching a course called Globalization and Local Politics. Globalization, from Saskia Sassen, and many people in the U.S. are now talking about globalization as meaning Wall Street. If you buy and sell and you spread it internationally, that's globalization. Okay, the paper is by California, Herm Boschkin. He wrote a paper, and then he's following up here with actual data in detail to show that globalization has, if we look more closely, there are many different types of globalization. And two or three to contrast are culture and aesthetics, where globalization can include having, say, a movie come from Hollywood, or a movie can come from Rome, or a movie can come from Bollywood in India, and each of these has at least different